Hello and welcome to the Captain's Table. I'm your host, Dawn Deckman Mohler, and today our guest is Joan Borsten Vidov, a former journalist who, together with her late husband, the famous Russian actor Oleg Vidov, made a name for herself as a film producer and advocate for addiction and mental health parity. Welcome to the show, Joan. We sure appreciate it.
Thank you, Dawn.
We are so excited. You have an amazing life, and I have been honored in the last couple of weeks to have an opportunity to get to know you and your late husband and his stories and his life, Oleg Vidov. I've been able to learn your roots, some of the amazing things that you did in Israel, how you all met, and the legacy of his life that you have been involved in with the feature film that we're going to talk about today. I'm so happy you're here. What we're going to do is take a super quick break for our sponsors, and then we're going to come back into our show. Stand by. Welcome back to the Captain's Table with our guest, Joan Borsten Vidov. So good to have you here, Joan. I really want our audience to hear about your life today. And there's going to be some action items at the end, some places where they can go to learn more about you and Oleg's life with the film that you produced. So let's kind of start with the beginning, a little bit about your history, where you grew up. I think you grew up in Santa Monica, right?
I was born in Santa Monica a few years after the end of World War II. My mother was a native of North Dakota who became one of the Navy's first 10 officers, female officers, after Pearl Harbor was bombed. And in the end, and she was sent to Hawaii. She was in charge of transportation for the Navy. And at the end of the war, she was a lieutenant commander.
That's amazing.
So, yeah, I know. And my father was, he came to Hollywood in 1944. He was born in Georgia. And he did lots of really interesting things in the film industry. He was a publicist. He wrote a column about Hollywood. He wrote one of the first 10 Outer Limits. And as a studio executive, he worked for MGM and Universal and representing a lot of, working with a lot of really incredible people like Alfred Hitchcock, for instance. And after he retired, he co-wrote a book called The Loving Gentleman, the love story of William Faulkner and Maida Carpenter. Maida Carpenter was a Hollywood, in those days they called them script girls. She became a script supervisor.
Sure, I know the term.
And they had this long affair. And came to my father and said, I want to tell the story with you because everybody else in Hollywood wants to write it and they'll get it wrong. And then with my mother, he co-wrote a book about her experience as one of the Navy's first women officers. So that's the home that I grew up in.
Well, my goodness, Joan, what amazing parents and the history that they have in our country.
As I know it now, yes, I had amazing parents and grew up in an amazing home, but then it was just my parents in my home.
Did you ever go down to the old Santa Monica Pier when you were growing up?
Sure.
Did they have the Ferris wheel back then?
Yes.
I know they did. As a matter of fact, I've heard that the one of the original Ferris wheels, maybe the second one, is actually in Oklahoma City. Somebody acquired it, but that's a little bit of a tangent there.
Wow.
Your dad's work is amazing. I had looked up some of the people that he was a publicist with, and I had read Dorothy Dandridge and Hattie McDaniel.
Right. Mario Lanza.
And Mario Lanza.
I remember we went to Palm Springs to Mario Lanza's home for some reason. And all the kids were put into the guest house and all the adults stayed in the main house. And at midnight, it was announced that Mario wanted everybody, including the kids, to show up at the pool so he could sing.
That is unbelievable. Nobody could even make that up. I love that. Well, tell me a little bit more about, your school years.
So in junior high, in the 8th grade, I met another student whose name was Michael Berman, who became one of my lifelong friends. So his older brother, Howard, and Howard's friend Henry Waxman were really active in the California Young Democrats.
Yes.
So Michael organized a bunch of us to support candidates that Howard and Henry were backing, which meant, we would be driven to the headquarters and we would spend hours stuffing envelopes. Or it was called sniping. We would snipe posters around the city. So we would quickly go and put them up on, bridges and whatever, and then we would run away so that nobody would know that.
You were in junior high?
It was junior high and high school.
Okay.
And actually, when we got to high school, that's when we started knocking on doors and explaining why we wanted voters to support whoever our candidate was at that moment. And then a bunch of us went to Berkeley, and we formed something called the AAA Young Democrats. AAA because that would be the first on the roll call.
That's so smart.
And the Vietnam War was raging. There were protests all over campus. We organized a distinguished speakers program, and I'm proud to say we had the idea to invite Senator Eugene McCarthy to speak. And someone stood up and said, are you going to run against President Lyndon Johnson? And he said yes. And that was a national first. We were the ones. That was where it happened.
Gosh.
And it was really exciting. And so I took a leave of absence from Berkeley, and I worked for his campaign, and my job was to tour university campuses with his daughter, Mary. So I really felt like I was part of something very important. And then Bobby Kennedy entered the race. I was really upset because, I loved Bobby Kennedy.
Yes.
But I had to stay. But I stayed faithfully with McCarthy, and I was heartbroken when Bobby was assassinated.
As was the whole country.
Anyway, Michael left Berkeley after our sophomore year, and he ran campaigns that elected first Henry and then Howard to the California State Assembly and then to the Congress. And we were too young to vote, but I remember walking door to door with both of them during their campaigns. Henry was in a very Jewish district of Los Angeles called Fairfax.
I was just down there a couple weeks ago by Canner's Deli. Yeah.
So when we knocked on the door of like an old Jewish mother, she already knew that he was single, and so she would say, "Oh, Mr. Waxman, I will vote for you, but have I got a girl for you?"
Matchmaker.
And so my job was to skillfully maneuver him to another door.
Oh my goodness.
And then when Howard ran the first time, it was a very part of it was a very right-wing district, and they were all Republicans. And finally, I found who I thought were Democrats. It was this very young couple who answered the door, and they were artists, and they were painting over Governor Jerry Brown's waterbed a picture of a mural of himself and his father. So I said, "Howard, quick, come. I think I found some Democrats." So they were Democrats, but they weren't registered to vote.
Oh, goodness. Well, I'm surprised you didn't have a voting deal to get them registered.
Also, when I was walking precincts for McCarthy, they took us to Milwaukee one day. And, everyone said, "Oh, McCarthy's running again," meaning Joe.
Yes.
And I had to ask I said to the campaign headquarters, "Well, what am I supposed to say?" Because I didn't want to lie, but I didn't want to promote Joe McCarthy either.
Oh my goodness.
So I changed precincts. I refused to walk that one anymore.
Oh, you didn't want to do the Milwaukee precinct anymore.
No.
It was probably pretty cold too.
It was different.
It was different. It was different.
Anyway, so Michael recently passed, which was very sad.
Yeah.
But he was ahead of his time in terms of how to elect candidates to office. And he influenced a large group of us to become activists, not just in politics, but in what we do with our lives. And we always would thank him for making us liberal Democrats and activists. And he was sort of embarrassed but proud.
Wow. Why would you say that? Why was he embarrassed but proud?
Because I think he didn't think of himself as someone who was influential. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times when he was sick, we would all call him collectively. And we would all tell him, "Oh, thank you, Michael." And he would just sort of say, "Oh, no, don't worry. Don't talk about that."
Oh, well, I've actually interviewed another guest, and I know a couple other people from being on the Captain's Table Project podcast show that have also worked with Michael Berman, and they have nothing but wonderful things to say about him. So what an opportunity. Tell me a little bit about, I guess, after graduating from Berkeley.
So I graduated with a degree in comparative literature, and I joined the Peace Corps. And I served as a volunteer in this godforsaken village called Rincon de las Palmas. Very remote. It had no water, no running water, no electricity. You had to drive through 2 rivers. There were no bridges to get there.
Wow.
It was about 100 families spread out over 5 square miles. And it was definitely, I like to say, the toughest job I ever loved. So I did 2 things that made a difference in that village. And I want to tell you about them just because it shows that you don't have to build a school in order to have an impact.
Right.
So the village did have a 6-room school, which was built by the first generation of Peace Corps volunteers in Panama. And everybody sent their kids to those 6 grades, but that was it. And when I got there, there was one little boy who had convinced the priest to send him to Panama City to live with the bishop's mother so that he could go to junior high school. And every time he came back to the village, he would tug on my shoulder, my sleeve, and he would say, Juanita, Juanita, send me to America. I want to learn English so I can be an engineer on the Panama Canal.
Wow.
So I changed his life and a lot of other people's lives simply by picking up the phone and calling my friends in San Leandro, California, and said, would you take an exchange student? And they said yes. So he flew to Los Angeles. My mother picked him up at the airport. He didn't even have a suitcase. And she sent him to San Leandro. And after a year there, he came back. And I don't know, 30 years later, when I took Oleg and my stepson Sergey to Panama and to my village, he was the one who picked us up at the airport. He was driving a Jeep. He worked on the Panama Canal. And the most amazing thing is that because people in that village saw the difference he made in his family's life in the village, they all began to send at least one child to higher education. So, I mean, that's one of the 2 things that I did there that I'm really very proud of. And as I said, all I did was make a phone call.
I am so proud of you. Do you know that making a phone call can really change someone's life, like the story that you just said? That is so touching. And the longevity of children doing that and the parents seeing how important that is for their kids. That's an amazing story.
So the other thing that I did was I was actually trained in the Peace Corps to be part of a group of women volunteers who went from village to village teaching about nutrition and health and whatever. But my village was so remote, I couldn't participate. So I was trying to figure out what I could do to occupy 24 hours a day. And in the meantime, I rented for, I think, $9 a month or $10 a month a house in the village. The Peace Corps came and they put in a cement floor. For a long time, I was the only cement floor in the village. And I decided to decorate my mud hut. So I got from the villagers, they used to decorate their hats at holidays with these, like they called them suns. And it was like straw interwoven with beautiful embroidery thread. And I made a mobile for my mud hut. And every Peace Corps volunteer who actually managed to get to that village would say, "Oh, I want one of those mobiles."
And what was what was on the mobile?
Just these suns in beautiful colors.
Oh wow!
And so they like hung. I had like 12, I think. 1, 2, 3. I got one in front of me.
You have one in front of you.
Yeah. So I still have it hung. So it was like I had these 12 suns hanging from 3 pieces, a triangle of bamboo. So I thought, well, if the Peace Corps volunteers want them, let me have 12 of them. Let me take 12 of them to Panama City and see if I can get one of the tourist stores to buy them.
Right.
And I did. And I came back, and 2 weeks later, the USAID came barreling into my village through the 2 rivers, and they said, "Where's the Peace Corps volunteer?" So I said, "Here I am." And they said, "The store says they need 12 more."
Oh.
And that became the second income for that village and for the adjacent village. And when I went back 30 years later with Sergey and Oleg, it was still the second income.
Joan. So also, that was their second income with the beautiful mobiles. And was it Gito or Hito?
Hito.
Hito. And Hito working on the Panama Canal.
Yep.
And everyone in the village now sending a child to get higher education. That's quite a legacy, yep. Joan, in your own right.
I understand that it is, and I'm very proud of it. But what I'm most proud of is that, like, I didn't have to, like, hand build a dam,
right,
or anything like that. I just did two things that it turned out made a difference, which means that you can always make a difference.
You can always make a difference. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come right back. Hold on. Welcome back to the Captain's Table with our wonderful guest, Joan Borsten Vidov. Wonderful stories about your work in the Rincon de la Palmas, in the Panama area. You already have started to build a legacy for yourself, Joan. I'm very proud of you and the things that you did there. These are fantastic stories. Let's talk a little bit about June 1973.
So I got my master's degree from USC in bilingual education because, of course, by the time I came back from Panama, I was bilingual. I was fluent in Spanish. And for some reason, I decided that I needed a third language so that I could become like an expert for the California Board of Education in multilingual education.
Okay.
So I decided to go to Israel. There was a year program for young Western college graduates where for 6 months you learned Hebrew in an intensive situation. And then for the next 6 months, you worked in Israel using those language skills to become more fluent. So I got to Israel, I think, in June of 1973, and we started learning Hebrew. And when it got to October, there was Yom Kippur, which is it was a very special day in Israel. It was very holy. Even if you weren't religious, you like stayed at home and contemplated and thought. And everything was silent. There were no buses, there were no trains, there was nothing. And in the afternoon, I looked out my apartment window and I saw all of these like pickup trucks coming into the center of town, all of these young soldiers running and jumping into the trucks, and off they went. And nobody knew what was going on. And finally, at sunset, the Israeli radio began to broadcast again, because usually they broadcast all day. And they said that Israel had been invaded by Egypt and Syria. It was a surprise. Nobody expected it. And everybody was, all of the men had been called to the reserves who weren't already serving in the army. And to say it was a shock is, it was just unbelievable. And we all thought because of the 6-day war, it would be over in 6 days, but it wasn't. So what were we going to do? The language school thought that we should all go to a kibbutz and hoe tomatoes, but none of us wanted to do that. Mm-hmm. So we found a development town farther down south in the Negev that was really a failed development town. And they needed volunteers to help during the war. So we went as volunteers, and we helped clean out bomb shelters. We helped teach in the schools, even though we could barely speak Hebrew. We helped entertain the troops that were stationed there. And it was just one of these life experiences that, my closest friends are still the people that I spent that war with. So you can imagine that October 7th,
right,
when Hamas invaded southern Israel, and again, the government had no clue that it was about to happen, that it was like happening all over again. It was just, a shock. And I can't believe that the government didn't know what was going to happen.
Well,
the second time.
When we had one of our first conversations, and you had told me briefly this story, it was probably literally a couple hours later that on the national news that the story that you had told about what you had witnessed in 73, that was definitely brought up on national TV. And I just thought, my goodness, to to see this happen twice in a lifetime is more than anyone can really.
And of course, I'm here. I'm not in Israel,
I know.
but I have friends who were there.
I know.
And I have a friend who was with me, and she got on a plane to go home. And she got to Jerusalem just as the air raid siren started.
Well, we all need to hold up Israel. Tell me about some of the people that you also met there while you were doing your studies. Did you move to Jerusalem?
So after the war, we came back to Iran, which is where we were studying.
Okay.
We finished our studies, and I moved to Jerusalem with friends, but I somehow didn't find a job. And just miraculously, I became a staff reporter for the Jerusalem Post, which is Israel's English language daily.
Of course you did.
I went home to see my parents, and on the way back, I wrote a story, not for a newspaper. I just wrote a story called Back in the Diaspora. And my friend said, you know what, this is a really good story. Why don't you give it to the Jerusalem Post? So I said, who do I know at the Jerusalem Post? And someone said, oh, call so-and-so. So I called so-and-so, and he said, well, I'm the sports editor, so I can't really help you. But as long as so-and-so told you to call me, so tell the editor I said that you should call him. And the next thing I knew, it was in the weekend magazine. And everybody was calling and saying to the Jerusalem Post, who's the new journalist? So they decided to hire me. And interestingly enough, the only beat that was available was covering non-Jewish minorities, Bedouin, Muslims, Christian Arabs, Druze, Bedouin, and nobody wanted it, but I did. I had a great time, and I learned a lot, and I thought it was really important that I was telling their stories. And eventually it led to, after Sadat came to Israel, I don't think I've told you this before, after Sadat came to Israel, they needed someone to commute between Tel Aviv and Cairo and write feature stories. And I was the only one who didn't have a family. So that was me. I got to do that. And it was an amazing, amazing assignment.
Did your mom and dad ever worry about you?
Well, my mother used to call the LA Times all the time and say, where's my daughter?
What country is she in?
At one point they called me, I was in Kuwait. They knew I was in Kuwait, and they blew up the American embassy.
Oh, no.
My mother called and said, where's my daughter?
Oh, my, you must have worried them sick. My goodness. So what happened next? I'm just on pins and needles wanting to know.
So I had this interesting job. So for the Jerusalem Post, I interviewed politicians mostly, and I covered the piece with Egypt and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And I got to write cover stories. I interviewed Jihan Sadat, who was the first lady of Egypt. I interviewed Wasila Bourguiba, who was the first lady of Tunisia. And then I began working also for the LA Times entertainment section. And I literally traveled from Spain to India and Poland. Yeah, calendar.
Yeah, that was our favorite part of the paper on Sundays.
Right. So I literally traveled through all these countries covering film production and what they call the politics of culture.
Okay.
So I interviewed a lot of really famous directors and actors, Fellini, Ingrid Bergman, Jack Lemmon, George C. Scott, Raul Julia, Barbra Streisand, Tony Curtis, Roman Polanski, Walter Matthau. But I also, for instance, I got to go to a film festival in a country called Burkina Faso, which at that time was the 13th poorest country in the world. But anyway, they had a film festival, rain or shine, every 2 years. And Dawn, that is where I learned the importance of the moving image, the impact that it has. Mm-hmm. Because in the afternoon, they had a charismatic young president, and he would get a pickup truck and borrow a generator from the U.S. Embassy and go into and then we would take a film from the festival into the boonies, and they would project it on a school wall.
Wow. And
people would come walking for hours and hours with babies on their backs to watch a movie in a language they didn't understand, totally transfixed by the moving image.
Yes. My goodness. That's amazing. I want to know, when you mentioned Fellini, I'm kind of going back to, what was it like to interview him?
I think he was the smartest person I ever interviewed. He was just, it was something amazing. And then I think you know that when they sent me after I interviewed Fellini, the Times sent me to New Delhi.
Okay.
To interview Fellini's fortune teller. And those were the days. Those were the days before the internet. So Fellini would mail him scripts. This is what the interview was about, and the guru would read them and send back notes to Fellini about the script and say, don't make this movie. Do make this movie.
So he kind of relied on the fortune teller a bit.
I don't know if he relied on him, but he consulted with him.
Consulted with him, not relied, but consulted.
And the guru actually showed me all this correspondence. It was, there in a folder, along with all of these scripts. What
about Ingrid Bergman?
Ingrid Bergman was playing Golda. I interviewed her in Israel when she came to play Golda.
What was George C. Scott like?
I just remembered that it was a good interview. So was Raul Julia.
Mm-hmm.
Tony Curtis was in a lot making a movie, and he said to me, I don't have time to go to Jerusalem before I leave. Yeah. But, my grandfather used to be a famous rabbi.
Okay.
So could you go to the religious section and buy me one of the outfits that those rabbis used to wear? So I said, okay. And I put on a long sleeve blouse and a really long skirt. And I went in and I asked for this. It's called a streimel, which was the name of the coat, and a capota, which was the name of the hat. And they said to me, why would you want that? So I made up the story about my uncle. I bought it. I sent it to Tony Curtis. He sent it back and said it's too small. So I had to go back. I had to go back to the religious section, which is called Mea Sharim, and exchange it. And they said,
why?
they said, you know what? We read a story in the Jerusalem Post.
Oh.
Why didn't you tell us it was for a famous actor? And I said, I thought you would charge extra money. And they said, who is Tony Curtis? They don't go to movies.
Oh God, you just can't write this. You can't write this stuff. Well, now I'm very curious. Where was Barbara Streisand when you interviewed her?
She was in Israel.
Okay,
and she was promoting Yentl.
I was going to say Yentl. Sure.
And she made a mistake because she showed the film on a Friday night, and the religious in Israel were furious.
Oh.
So I tried to help her come up with an explanation that would, just apologize, but say that she didn't know.
Okay. And then where was Walter Matthau?
Walter Matthau was making a Roman Polanski film in Tunisia. It was called Pirates.
That I'm going to have to look up because I was trying to figure that out. So Roman Polanski, what was that interview?
Roman Polanski directed a comedy.
What was that interview like with him?
Roman Polanski or Walter Matthau?
Walter Polanski. Roman Polanski.
Roman Polanski is uber talented, and he knew everything. He was the director, but he'd been well trained in a film school in Poland, and he knew how to do every job. If somebody called in sick, the cameraman called in sick, or the wardrobe, he knew how to do all of that. So he was really amazing that way, but he was also a perfectionist. And so when they would do a pickup shot, which I don't know, you should be able to do in 3 or 4 shots, it would be 100. But very talented man. I was really honored to meet him and hear, stories about the films that he had made in the past. And of course, as you know, he was already out of the United States, and Tunisia didn't have an extradition treaty with the U.S., I guess. So that's how he was able to make this pirate movie there.
This is extraordinary. I am just fascinated by this part of your life. I think what we're going to do is take a final break and then come in and finish out some of the other stories that you have in your life and about how you met Oleg. So let's take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Okay.
Welcome back to the Captain's Table. We are enjoying our time with Joan Borsten Vidov and her amazing stories from her life. We're going to segue into a time that she met Oleg Vidov, and we'll go ahead and move right into that right now, Joan. So What year did you meet Oleg?
I met Oleg in 1985, but when I interviewed Fellini's fortune teller,
Yes.
after the interview, he took my hand and he said, "You're going to marry a man from a strange country." And I wrote it down, the word strange. And you know what? They sent me to a lot of strange countries, but no Romeo.
But no Romeo.
And then they moved me to Italy, which was definitely not a strange country. And the Robert Redford of the Soviet Union came to Italy to defect. And he definitely came from a strange country.
Right.
So if you remember, I don't if you know a movie called Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yes.
So the Leonardo DiCaprio character is built in part on the American actor Richard Harrison, who went to Italy, I guess, in the early 60s and became like a spaghetti Western gladiator star.
Yes.
And he was my friend. He and his wife Francesca were my friends. And I was in between apartments in Rome. I'd given up one to get a better one. And I was staying with them. And who arrives at their house but Oleg? How's that for fate? He only had one address in Rome.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, really unbelievable. And it just, it just happened.
That fortune teller really got that spot on.
Right. So Oleg, my father told me no actors. So I was a little worried when this happened, this romance happened very quickly. And I knew that he was a famous Russian actor or Soviet actor, but I didn't know how famous until one day we were walking around Rome and someone yelled out, Oleg Vidov, what are you doing in Rome?
Oh my goodness.
And it was this famous American film critic who used to go to the Moscow Film Festival. And he said to me, Joan, do you know who this man is? And I said, well, I heard that he was like the Robert Redford of Russia. No, I said, he's a Russian actor. And he said, no, my dear, he's the Robert Redford of Russia.
Oh my goodness.
And I thought, oh my God. Anyway, the American, when he went to the embassy to defect, they knew who he was and they gave him immediate political asylum because in those days, and I think probably now today, anybody who was atop anything in the Soviet Union immediately got asylum. He was the first actor. But I mean, scientists and engineers and whatever talent, wanted to leave, we took. So he came to Hollywood. There were huge headlines from coast to coast. Soviet, they were like Soviet actor comes west. Right. And I mean, just every newspaper you can imagine. And I joined him a few months later.
It would have been like a Baryshnikov.
Yes, except the Baryshnikov didn't have to have good English to dance. There was a difference. Mm-hmm. I mean, really, part of the problem was if you're an actor, you need to be able to speak, and your English has to be good enough that the audiences can understand you. And it was still the Cold War.
Sure.
And nobody was writing scripts for good-looking Russians. And half the casting directors said to him, you don't look like a Russian, because for them, a Russian was supposed to be like this KGB thug. And that wasn't Oleg.
He looks like the Robert Redford of Russia. I've seen his photos. Very handsome man. And it was, it was hard to learn all the lines, but I think he could have learned the lines, but when he was, some of the parts he was offered, he had to say things like, kill the Russians. Okay.
And, he left behind his mother, his father. He had a son he left behind. He didn't want them to be sent to prison or whatever because of what he was saying in a movie. So eventually he got his first break with the director was Walter Hill, and he cast him as Arnold Schwarzenegger's partner in Red Heat. And that kind of launched him. And he did some really interesting roles, but it wasn't going to be what it had been before in the Soviet Union. So, and I can already tell you that my husband never had a small idea. When I met him, it was already his character. He just saw everything in big ways.
So was there ever a time with, of course, Red Heat, and I think I read in some of your documentation also.
Wild Orchid, 13 Days.
Right. Was there ever a regret of defecting?
No.
Okay.
It just was not a country that he was prepared to live in.
Understood.
He was enamored of the culture. He was enamored of the music, the ballet, the writing, but he was not enamored of the Soviet system. And he loved the fact that nobody bothered him here. He could basically do whatever he wanted as long as he didn't commit a crime.
He could live his life.
Yes, that was so important to him. But anyway, in 1991, he was already an American citizen.
Okay.
And the Danes offered him the lead in a movie they wanted to make about Yeltsin and the attempt to overthrow the government. And he took the lead, and he went to Russia to make it. And first he went to Mosfilm, which was the studio he was most closely connected to. And on the sound stages where he'd made some of his greatest films, they were storing, cigarette cartons. No movies were being made.
Wow.
And then, for reasons never clear to me, he went to the animation studio. So the Russian animation was, it was beautiful, feel good, good values, good moral standards. Those were the kind of animated films. There were 1,200 of them that they made for the children of the Soviet Union. And every Russian that you know, at least from Oleg's generation and before, are in love with them. So they said to him, they're looking for a distributor in the West. And he said, who but me?
Right. Sure.
I love the animation. Now I speak English. I can do this. So he sort of went from being an actor to a distributor. But because the animation, the quality of the materials they sent us was in such bad condition, he also became like a post-production producer. And so we made a contract with the studio. I actually flew to Moscow in April, I think, or May of 1992, just by myself. I don't know why he didn't come. I couldn't speak a word of Russian. And I went to negotiate this contract with them. But anyway, the contract said that they would give us films in good quality, but they weren't. So we realized that we had to restore them. And I said to Oleg, first of all, I don't know who you're going to sell them to. But secondly, do you know what it's going to cost to restore them and revoice them?
Right.
But, nothing ever bothered him. So one of the other really amazing things that happened in my life was, of course, he knew everybody. So there was a captain and a colonel who were from the Soviet Air Force. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, all the planes belonged to the country where they were parked at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine got most of the big cargo planes. So he made a deal with these two. These Russians had gone to the new Secretary of the Army, I guess, or Air Force, and he gave them 12 planes. They carried like 50 tons each. And he said, and they agreed that they would go make money for Ukraine and, of course, for themselves. So Oleg told them that, yes, I would go to the United Nations and bid for contracts for humanitarian flights. So because they could easily financially compete with bids from Americans because they were just old Soviet cargo planes run by, crewed by former Soviet Air Force people. And it was a lot cheaper than hiring an American crew in American planes. So another important thing that happened to me in my life was that in a former Soviet cargo plane with former Soviet pilots who had been our enemies, 5-7 years ago?
Yes.
We delivered for several years humanitarian aid every day to Sarajevo. We flew from Zagreb to Sarajevo, from Nairobi to Mogadishu. We dropped food all over Angola. It was like the most thrilling thing because we'd just been enemies. And now we were doing, something so wonderful.
You and Oleg were on those flights or on some of those flights?
No, we were running operations from Los Angeles, but
okay.
We did go at one point to Zagreb, and we did fly to Sarajevo just to see what it was like, and they were shooting at us at the plane.
Oh my goodness!
And then when for the movie I interviewed the captain of the planes, he told me that Oleg had sneaked in a few other times without telling me, and flown on those crazy flights.
My goodness!
But that was him, the hero.
The hero, absolutely. Goodness gracious! Well, what happened with the animation?
So we restored the animation. We partnered first with Phil Roman from Film Roman and did one series of children's animation, and then we partnered with Baryshnikov. And Baryshnikov and the Audrey Hepburn Foundation brought in all of these famous actors to revoice the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
And Oleg sold it to 55 countries. And I can't remember how many languages it was dubbed into.
Right.
And so, and then began problems with the Russian government, really the Ministry of Culture, because for them, the animation was worthless. You know, they would like throw it into a pile of stuff that they would give away to somebody who bought a Tarkovsky film to distribute.
Mm-hmm.
They had no idea it had value.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly it was playing on PBS, and they were like, oh, it has value. Let's try to steal it back.
Right.
So we all ended up in court in New York and the federal court in Brooklyn with a tough law and order judge named David Traeger. And they tried to prove to him that we bought the rights from the wrong studio in 1992 because they created in 1999 a new studio with exactly the same name.
Oh.
And that was who we should have bought the rights from.
Okay.
And Judge Traeger was having none of it. And he found against them. So he found in our favor. And then they appealed, and they brought him a decision from a Russian court that said he didn't know what he was talking about. And then our lawyer went to that same court to get some documents that she was missing, and an angry judge who thought that Russia was going to go to rule of law but didn't, gave her a secret supervisory file, and in it was a letter from the deputy prime minister instructing the Russian judge to rule against the American judge. And Judge Traeger really went berserk, and he said, I wouldn't let the American government interfere in my courtroom, much less the Russian government.
Mm-hmm.
So we won, and then somehow we got a call from this oligarch who said he wanted to buy back the rights and bring the animation back to Russia.
Okay.
So I said, fine, I've had enough of this.
Well, so you're out of the animation business, but I'm going to tell the audience that by the end of this show, you're going to learn more about a film, an award-winning film documentary that Joan produced called Oleg. And when you watch this film, you're going to see some absolutely beautiful animation. It was one of the best parts of the film, Joan, was watching the animation being restored and the beautiful colors. So that is a real treat, which will be for our audience when they get to view the film. After you sold the animation library to the Russian oligarch, tell me briefly about how you got into the drug treatment center in Malibu, and then we're going to wrap up with the story that you want to tell us about the film.
So after we sold the animation back to the Russians, the animation, by the way, is still here in a film storage unit in North Hollywood.
Oh, wow.
They never took it back.
Unbelievable.
So my stepson married the daughter of a famous Russian addiction scientist who wanted to bring his very unique methodology here. I should say unique and very effective. And nobody would rent to them because they were going to have addicts in the house. So my husband said, okay, well, let's buy a house and rent it to them. But you have to be the CEO because they're scientists. They don't know anything about business. Mm-hmm. And I said, Oleg, I don't drink and I don't do drugs. He said, no, it's just a business, which absolutely wasn't true. So the upshot of it was that we ran this treatment center successfully. It was bought by a medical investment division of Wells Fargo eventually. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, I tried to find a place for myself at the table with the other CEOs, all of whom were in recovery for 10 years, 5 years, 7 years, whatever. And then there was me. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to take my political experience, my Peace Corps experience, my journalist experience, I'm going to become an advocate and try to solve some of the problems that they don't seem to be able to solve for themselves. And so I've been doing that, for quite a few years now, pretty successfully. And I'm very proud that I've been able to make changes in industry that supposedly has parity but doesn't.
You just pulled all of your skills together to be able to do one more thing in your life for other people.
In the meantime, Oleg passed unexpectedly on May 15th, 2017 from multiple myeloma, which is an incurable form of cancer.
Very sorry.
And everybody was surprised because he refused to tell any of his friends that he was ill. And so many people arrived at the funeral that the funeral center had to set rows and rows of extra chairs outside, and we had to broadcast the ceremony outside.
Oh, my goodness.
And he was laid to rest at Hollywood Forever, which is a cemetery next door to Paramount. And it was really the saddest day of my life. And Sergei married his second wife a few months later. That was already scheduled. All of them knew about it. And I went with them to Moscow for celebrations, and then I came home and went to bed.
Oh,
and
hard
in
time.
December, I remembered that he had left me an autobiography he'd been writing for 3 years. And as I said, he never did anything small, so it included a list of 60 people to be interviewed in 8 countries in order to complete certain chapters of the book. So first of all, the book was in Russian. So I had to find a translator. So I Googled, and I found that the greatest translator from Russian to English was Antonina Boyce, who lives in New York. So she translated it for me. And then I began doing all of these interviews, and it was clear that this was going to be a movie. I mean, that it should be a documentary.
Uh-huh.
So I produced it. It took about 3 years. I hired a team, a really talented, award-winning team who knew about the Soviet Union, because I couldn't take the time to teach somebody about the Soviet Union. So the director is a very award-winning Australian director. His name is Nadia Tass, whose grandparents escaped from the Bolshevik Revolution.
My goodness.
The narrator is Brian Cox, who you know is the star of Succession. But guess what? He taught acting in the Soviet Union for 2 years.
That's just unbelievable.
And
what a wonderful voice and actor. I didn't know that.
I kept calling this agent who hires people who do, actors who give their voices. And every time I said somebody, he said, no, you want Brian Cox. Mm-hmm. So finally I said to him, why Brian Cox? So he tells me that, he lived there for 2 years. He taught acting. He wrote a book about his experience, and the BBC produced for him a 2-part series called Brian Cox's Russia.
Oh my goodness.
And I thought he was fabulous.
Just perfect.
And then,
yes, he was.
I needed someone whose native language was Russian, but who was really understandable in English to be Oleg's voice. And that's how I hired Costa Ronan, who you probably know from The Americans and Homeland.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes.
Anyway, so we filmed all over.
All over Europe?
We did interviews I started in Canada. From Canada, I went to Belgrade. Mm-hmm. From Belgrade, I went to Sarajevo. From Sarajevo, I went to Austria. From Austria, I went to Germany. From Germany, I went to Russia. Oh, and we also interviewed people from Denmark, and I don't know where else. Just in order, he had a big life. I don't know what else to say about that. Mm-hmm. We were almost done when the pandemic hit. And the scene that we really had to finish, and we couldn't, was the opening scene, which we called The Great Escape, yes. Which is how Oleg crossed the border illegally from Yugoslavia into Austria. But because it was the pandemic, the border was closed.
Oh, okay.
The other problem was that even though it was eventually going to reopen, Australia told the director that if she went there to film it, she couldn't come back into Australia. Oh. So we managed to find fancy equipment, and literally from her office in Melbourne, she cast the film. She directed the film. I mean, not the film, that sequence, the opening sequence of the film, which is,
it's beautiful.
I think quite extraordinary. But it was all filmed from her office in Australia.
Was it by using a drone?
That we used a drone, but she had 4 different fancy pieces of technology on her desk, one of which controlled the drone, one of which controlled this scene and that scene.
Yes.
I really think it was a miracle that she got what she got.
Well, it's beautiful. It's almost like seeing the opening of The Sound of Music. It's so beautiful.
Thank you. So we finished the film, and it's now being broadcast already in Europe and Israel. It'll soon begin broadcasting in Australia and Italy. I'm working on a sale to a U.S. streamer. And I'm showing the film on campuses in the U.S. because, you know what, Gen Z, they were born after the USSR ceased to exist, and they don't know anything about it. And it's so interesting for me to talk to them in the Q&A after I show the film because it helps them to understand what's going on in Russia now.
It could be part of a curriculum down the road, Joan. Yes, absolutely.
Good idea.
So let me ask you, for the benefit of our audience, tell us how we can see this film, or do we need to wait till it's streaming?
You need to wait until it's streaming, but I might give you an idea before you actually broadcast about who people can send text or emails to and say, please buy this film. Hopefully it will already have been bought, but if not, then you can help me that way.
And also, our audience can reach out to our producers, and you can respond to this podcast that if there's a university in your area that would be interested in a film about Oleg's story, that we can get in touch with Joan that way too.
Yeah, and followed by, I'll be happy to come and do a Q&A.
That would be wonderful. I'm actually working on a university in my local area, and really excited to hopefully get you out here. And I'm in Oklahoma City, and get you to the Oklahoma City University campus. It might be in 2024, but I'm excited to work with you on this part of your life, Joan. I am amazed by your life. You have a beautiful life, and so many stories, so many layers in your life. You're a wonderful woman, and I've had such a good time getting to know you, and I'm looking forward to working with you in the future. We are just so happy that you came on the Captain's Table and shared a little bit about your life and Oleg's life, and your family and your kids and grandkids. Maybe one of these days we can have you back on.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to tell you and your listeners that if they go to olegvidovfilm.com, there's lots of material there about the movie.
All right. Say that one more time so we have that.
Oleg, O-L-E-G, Vidov, V-I-D-O-V, film.com.
Excellent. We will absolutely have that as an action item. And Joan, thank you so much. You have a great day, and thanks everybody for joining the Captain's Table. Bye-bye now.